Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by the UNSD DFID project on SDG monitoring. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope you're having a good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. This webinar will cover the linkages between the SDGs and COVID-19. And we have set aside 1.5 hours, as we have done for earlier webinars. We are very happy to have you all on board, and we are looking forward to hearing what will be said today. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with you afterwards. We will also share any other materials that might be relevant in the context. Please keep yourself muted if you're not speaking. You can ask questions in the chat window. And if there's some clarifications, please ask as well. You can either ask them to me directly, to the WebEx organizer directly, privately, or you can ask it to everyone. And we will try and respond throughout the webinar. And there's also set aside time for discussion at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. So as many of you have seen already, we have planned for this webinar for a few weeks now. And in the agenda that we shared, you saw some of the objectives, I believe. We will try and focus on the SDGs and the long-term view of the 2030 agenda, and we will do this in linkages and in the connection to the effect the pandemic has had on the society, and through that also on the SDGs. So in that regard, we will look at the potential impacts of the pandemic on the achievement of the SDGs. We will be sharing 2 country experiences during this webinar, which will focus on SDG monitoring and VNR preparation during the crisis. There will also be a general update on the global SDG indicator framework and outcomes of the most recent IAG SDG meeting and the upcoming 2020 high-level political forum. As you know, a lot of the regular work is progressing, even though we have the pandemic running. And we thought some of these updates would be important and useful for all of you to be aware of as well. In the discussion, we will discuss how the UNSD DFID project can better tailor technical assistance to project countries in support of the ongoing SDG monitoring. Next slide, please. So there's, I think you have a bit outdated version of this this presentation, Jaspreet. But maybe you can close and open again. Sorry for this. In the meantime, I'll let you know who the presenters are. My name, yes, here we go. My name is Vibeke Östreich-Nielsen. I think most of you already know me. I'm the UNSD DFID project coordinator, and I am giving this introduction. Please go one back, Jaspreet. Thank you. I will very soon introduce the first speakers. They will be discussing the potential effects of COVID-19 on the SDGs and the emerging evidence. We will first hear from Heather Page from UNSD, who will present the SDG progress report and updates on the work of the IAG SDGs. That means the Interagency Expert Group. Then we will hear from Elena de Jesus, who will be talking about how COVID-19 is changing the world, and will be showing us a statistical perspective, showing some of the work that some of the partners and international agencies have been doing in this field. Following that, we will hear from Dr. Nguyen Nguyen Mong, who will present how they have been working on better understanding the effects of COVID-19 on the SDGs in Myanmar. And After that, again, we will hear from Richard Tonkin from UNSD, who will be presenting a bit more in detail the impact of COVID-19 on the Sustainable Development Goals #1. This will be followed by a presentation by Mr. Moses Tegesa. He's a commissioner at the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda and will also give us a little bit more of a political side of the SDGs and how the pandemic has been affecting VNR preparation and also SDG implementation. We have set aside around 20 minutes for discussion at the end of this webinar, which will be ended with a conclusion and next steps. So as I said, please share any concerns, any questions you have in the chat window as the agenda progresses. We will be having some stops in between the presentations to ask clarifying questions, to follow up on some of the things that were discussed, and then we will have a more detailed discussion at the end. And with that, I would like to hand over the word to my colleague Heather Page. Heather, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much for having me. We really appreciate it. Next slide, please, Jaspreet. So I just wanted to provide an overview of the Secretary General's SDG progress report. This report is developed by the UN Data and Statistics Division in collaboration with around 40 international agencies. And it presents an overview of progress towards the SDGs to inform the high-level political forum and is based on the latest available data for the global SDG indicators. Actually, I think there was one slide before this, in case it's, yeah, great, thank you. So the key messages from the report, essentially 5 years into implementation of the 2030 Agenda, progress has been uneven and acceleration is needed in many areas. The world is not on track to deliver the SDGs by 2030. At the beginning of 2020, the Secretary General kickstarted the Decade of Action to deliver on the global goals, urging all actors to dramatically increase the pace and scale of implementation efforts. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic is further derailing the efforts to implement the SDGs and threatening achievements already made in many areas. The poorest and most vulnerable and countries are being affected disproportionately by the pandemic. And moving forward, it is essential that a truly transformative recovery from COVID-19 is pursued, one that reduces risk to future crises and brings us much closer to the inclusive and sustainable development required to meet the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement on climate change. So the pandemic has also highlighted the importance of data for designing short-term responses and long-term acceleration actions so that to set countries back on track to achieve the SDGs. And it is affecting critical operations across the global statistical and data systems, with statistical communities working on response mechanisms for ensuring that continual data collection during the pandemic to also inform crises and support the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. In the interest of time, I won't go through every goal, but we'll just highlight a few of those. Essentially, we have the 17 goals and the progress made before COVID-19 and the impact and implications of the pandemic on countries. So for instance, under goal 2, an estimated 26% of the world population, or 2 billion people, were affected by moderate or severe food insecurity in 2018. This was already an increase of 23% since 2014. And the pandemic is exacerbating hunger and food insecurity. For example, school closures around the world are leaving some 370 million school children missing free school meals that they have relied on. Next slide, please. In addition, globally in 2017, 2.2 billion people lacked safely managed drinking water, 4.2 billion lacked safely managed sanitation, and 3 billion people lacked soap and water at home. Water and sanitation and hand washing facilities are critical to prevent the spread of COVID-19, Yet 47% of schools worldwide lacked hand washing facilities with soap and water, and 40% of healthcare facilities were not equipped to practice hand hygiene. Again, like I mentioned, just in the interest of time, I won't go through each goal, but the information will be in the presentations, and I can also answer any questions on a specific goal if you have it in the chat. Next slide, please. Before the crisis, regarding Goal 8, the global economy was growing at a slower rate than in previous years, despite improvements in labor productivity and unemployment. Real GDP growth rate for LDCs was 4.5% in 2018, which is less than the 7% growth rate target called for in the 2030 agenda. The unprecedented shock to the world's labor markets is expected to result in a drop of 10.5% in aggregate working hours in the second quarter of 2020, which is equivalent to 305 million full-time workers, and impacting half of the global workforce. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 crisis is hitting the poorest and most vulnerable people the hardest and threatens to have a particularly damaging impact on the poorest countries. It's laying bare the profound inequalities that exist within and among countries and is exacerbating these inequalities. Next slide, please. Regarding Goal 17 and the partnership for the SDGs, the implementation for the SDGs has remained challenging due to scarce financial resources, trade tensions, technological obstacles, and a lack of data. Net ODA flows totaled 147 billion in 2019, which was almost the same level as in 2018. International funding for data and statistics, key for full implementation of the SDGs, is only around half the level that it needs to be. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus, over 100 billion in capital has flowed out of emerging markets, which is actually the largest outflow ever recorded. However, world trade is expected to plunge between 13 and 32% in 2020, and remittances to low and middle income countries are projected to fall by 20% in 2020. And there's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the 2030 agenda at the very core and poses a major threat to delaying the entire process. However, we just wanted, the report stresses that the principles of the SDGs are critical to the recovery, which can be a roadmap to help governments focus on growth, inclusion, equity, and sustainability. And it requires kind of a reaffirmation and the commitment to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, along with the realization of the Decade of Action. The report for the Secretary General on progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals can be found at the link provided in the presentation. Next slide, please. In addition to the Secretary General's report, we do also produce it's a glossy report, which will be launched on the first day of the HLPF. And this also focuses on SDG progress with a selection of indicators, as well as implications of the impacts of COVID-19. This report also includes infographics and a progress chart, and they will all be available on the website that is listed on the slide. Next slide, please. I just wanted to also provide a quick update of the SDG Global Indicator Framework. The IAG, the Interagency and Expert Group on SDGs, reported to the UN Statistical Commission in March, describing the year-long 2020 comprehensive review, which had recently concluded. This comprehensive review engaged with countries, international and regional organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector for a full comprehensive review of the framework. And it proposed and was approved 36 major changes to the framework in the form of replacements, revisions, additions, and deletions. Currently, the framework does not include any Tier 3 indicators, and the total number of unique indicators is now 231. I just wanted to mention that the revised global indicator framework, the list is available in PDF and also an Excel file on our website with the link provided in the slide. And an updated tier classification will be made available around September once review of the data availability is complete. And if you have any additional questions regarding the IAG, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this global overview, Heather. I think that is very useful for all of us. I now would like to hand over the word to Elena de Jesus, who will be presenting some more of the global work that has been done in looking at the effects of COVID on the SDGs. Please go ahead, Elena.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And also, hello, everyone. And thanks again to Heather for introducing the SDG progress report and contextualizing our discussion of the potential impacts of the pandemic on the achievement of the SDGs. Of course, normally the report focuses mostly on data that's collected before the year, so before the start of the pandemic. But the custodian agencies did provide an outlook for the coming year and also the possible long-term impacts of the pandemic. And of course, as we know, this is a constantly evolving scenario, and new data, new estimates come out almost every week. So I'm actually going to briefly present to you another important publication that came out at the end of April, beginning of May. So this focuses mostly on recent statistical evidence and also includes estimates and projections of the impacts of COVID-19 on economies and societies. The report is titled "How COVID-19 is Changing the World, a Statistical Perspective." And it was compiled jointly by 36 international organizations under the aegis of the Committee for the Coordination of Statistical Activities, CCSA. For those of you who may not be familiar, CCSA is comprised of international organizations that have as their mandate providing official international statistics, which have statistical services embedded in the organization and have regular contacts with countries. So a lot of the UN agencies, funds and programs contributed to this report, and also the World Bank, WHO, Asian Development Bank, OECD, Paris 21, and others as well. Just had a comment on my sound. Can you hear me better, hopefully? So the report provides, is that better? Okay. I'm going to assume you can hear me.
Yes, it's better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the report provides a snapshot of the data currently available, and it also highlights impacts on specific groups, such as women and children, and also looks into how different geographical regions are affected. And what I really found useful about the report is that each section, I hear some interference noise, sorry. If you could just mute yourself if you're not speaking. Thank you so much. So what I found really useful is that each section is labeled with the organization that contributed it, and it also clearly indicates a website where people can go to get some more recent analysis. Next slide, please. So just as an overview of the report and key messages, you can see them on the slide. Global production and manufacturing output is predicted to fall by 9%. And these are just some highlights. So the report is quite extensive. Value of global merchandise will also fall by about 27% in the second quarter. As my colleague Heather mentioned, the loss of employment and decline of almost 10.7% in the second quarter as well. Students, of course, affected by school closures, and 40 to 60 million people pushed into extreme poverty. And this is, of course, being felt throughout the world in every region. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to present you some key areas that the report touches on. There are many others that you can explore on your own. And the link is, of course, provided in the presentation. So the aviation industry is among the industries most affected by COVID-19, as we are all aware. It's seen roughly a 90% decline in demand. As demand hit zero, it saw around a 90% decline in fleet activity. And what's interesting here is that the International Civil Aviation Organization, who submitted the information, put together impact scenarios for 2020, depending on whether the recovery would follow a rapid curve, like a V curve, or a U curve, which is a slower recovery. And so you can see those two in yellow and red. And so, for example, we're looking at between a $300 and $400 billion loss in airline revenue, depending on how that curve looks for the recovery, and between a 13% and 32% decrease in merchandise trade volume. So, of course, this would affect most directly SDGs 9 and 17, which I've put on the slide. But the aviation industry, of course, impacts many other SDGs indirectly. Next slide, please. So closely linked to the aviation industry, of course, is the tourism sector, which is suffering an unprecedented crisis. The possible scenarios point to declines of between 60 and 80% in international tourism arrivals for the year, depending on how long travel restrictions and border shutdowns are going to be in place. There's, of course, many economies around the world that rely primarily on tourism, such as small island developing states. And of course, they will be hit hardest as a result, with potentially significant impacts to the achievement of SDG 8 and others. Next slide, please. And of course, tourism jobs are not the only ones impacted. As my colleague also mentioned, employment overall is taking a big hit. 94% of the world's workers are living in countries with some sort of workplace closure measures currently in place. And ILO now casts that global hours worked will drop by over 10% in the second quarter, which is equivalent to 310 million full-time workers that are not working. And of course, this also affects even more disproportionately youth employment and young people in general who face multiple shocks, such as disruption to their education and also employment. Next slide, please. And with regard to education, so school closures are impacting over 60% of the world. The population of students in the world are over 1 billion students. And of course, there's alternatives that are being explored in different countries, such as distance education over TV, radio, or online learning. However, given that less than half of households in the majority of countries around the world have access to internet, and a lot don't have a TV, this creates large discrepancies among countries, but also within countries between the urban and rural areas with regard to how people can access this alternative education while we're in this pandemic. Next slide, please. So children who are already left behind will likely bear the brunt of the pandemic's impact, whether through interrupted education, increased risk of violence, or missing out on life-saving vaccinations. So the graph presented here shows that several diseases have been kind of on a downward slope. We've been able to make headway with them. But of course, this could be affected by immunization campaigns that are interrupted. And this is, again, one of those factors that affects disproportionately the poor and children in remote areas. Next slide, please. COVID-19 also puts at risk the limited progress that's been made in gender equality and women's rights across every sphere, from health to economy, to security, the impacts of COVID-19 are exacerbated for women and girls. We have emerging data that shows that since the outbreak, violence against women has intensified. So we see here some cases from different countries that have been reporting on this. But also there's, of course, other factors such as unpaid care work, which predominantly falls on women, and that has increased, and other care work of older persons, which again, women are disproportionately affected by. Next slide, please. And of course, in terms of inequalities, as I mentioned, within and between countries, COVID-19 has deepened existing inequalities, hitting the poorest and most vulnerable communities the hardest. And it's put a spotlight on economic inequalities and fragile social safety nets that leave vulnerable communities to bear the brunt of the crisis. And UNDP has put together some heat maps of COVID-19 vulnerability based on human development levels. And you can see that if human development levels are lower, vulnerability is higher, of course. And these inequalities are also deepening for vulnerable populations, such as refugees and migrants, as well as indigenous people, marginalized minorities, older persons, persons with disabilities, and children. Next slide, please. And the report also touches on statistical impacts. And of course, as my colleague mentioned, and as we know, reliable and timely data are crucial in this extraordinary situation to be able to mitigate the harmful effects and to make swift policy decisions. But of course, the crisis makes data collection much more difficult. So this is a big census year, as we know, and also the following year. More than 120 countries are scheduled to conduct censuses, and it's expected that the 2020 census round will be severely impacted by the pandemic, and many censuses will fall behind, which also impacts, of course, monitoring the SDGs. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of a snapshot, and in fact, these are some of the statistics presented in the report. And I invite you to visit the websites of the contributing organizations for detailed, up-to-date data and analysis, and to get more information on this. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Elena. We are now moving into the national level, hearing an example from Myanmar. But before that, I just wanted to ask quickly if there's any clarifying questions that should be asked, if you have something that you want to hear more about before we move on to the country presentation. Okay. Then it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nui Mong from the Central Statistical Organization, where he is the Deputy Director. We are looking very much forward to hearing your presentation on the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on the SDG monitoring. Please go ahead.
Good evening.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I'm Dr. Nima from CSO Myanmar. The topic I'm going to go about is the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on SDG monitoring. Next slide. These 7 outlines. Next slide. I want to present the Myanmar SDG status. Is jointly coordinated with the UNDP, United Nations Development Program. In May, SDG data assessment report was published. It makes more clear two categories for improving of the national indicators to calculate the SDG data. Target of the assessments is readiness to indicate You can see clearly in the next slide in the pie chart, 7 assessment points. Then, and handbook of the SDG awareness was published. 17 goals, 179 targets, and 250 indicators are, and it was published in Myanmar's English version. Then, August 2017, our joint broken was the SDG indicator based on the books was published. Also, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Yes. 196 indicators are present in this SDG baseline reports. 20 separate indicators. So there are 61 SDGs are available in this baseline report. Next slide. I would like to present for COVID-19 to Myanmar. Myanmar is also affected for the COVID-19 impact. So that estimated 100,000 are returning to our country. And then some of them are affected for the COVID-19 impact. Up-to-date news from the Ministry of Health and Support today is about the 246 confirmed. 159 persons are recovered from COVID-19 and 6 persons is dead. Most of these death persons are particularly in elder persons, so we need to do the surveys for the vulnerable groups, especially particularly for men and children and old age persons. Next slide. So we have to do a plan for 2 survey plan. It was focused on the socio-economic impacts on household favor and field activities in urban areas. Then next one is the socio-economic assessments impact of COVID-19 in Myanmar. It was focused on 2 points. First assessment point is the vulnerable groups, and the second assessment point is entrepreneurs and digital transformation. Next slide. So we need to create jointly program with the UNDP in order to create COVID-19 high frequency dashboards. I'm going to present for the assessment of the impact of the COVID-19 on the key vulnerable groups are focusing on the identification and monitoring of the major socioeconomic impacts of key vulnerable population groups who lacks protected assets and savings and assets insurance and assures public health services. Assessment of the impact of the COVID-19 impact on entrepreneurship. This particularly includes youth, women-owned, and led businesses and micro small enterprises. Next slide. I would like to continue to present for me COVID-19 Economic Relief Plan, CRP. It was released on 2020. It was from the Ministry of Planning, Finance, and Ministry. To mitigate the range of COVID-19 effects on our national economy, and then it's also strengthened for the Myanmar economy, and it's to accelerate more sustainable development of Myanmar. It is aligned with Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan and Sustainable Development Goals. That's it consists of 10 strategies and 36 action plans are included. And I'm going to present for to continue the CRB plan also. CRB Goal 1, improving macroeconomic environment through monetary stimulus, as Goal 3 is the impact of the COVID-19. It's aligned with the SDG Goal 8. Next slide. And then CRB goes 6 is also to reopen of the student. Next slide. However, to obey all the teachers must be over the guidelines of the Myanmar Ministry of Health and Support and Racial Guideline. Next slide. I would like to continue to bring the 2020 awareness of the Myanmar. As the National Statistical Organization, CSO has formulated the national SDG indicators for development with the view of the monitoring and evaluation of the progress by cooperation with the line ministries. Next slide. So, sustainable development plan is aligned with economic policy and then regional commitments and then ASEAN economic communities and others. There are 3 pillars, 5 goals, 28 strategies, and 251 action plans. Then national indicator frameworks based on the process has already, it were published very soon in 2020 and 20. We have a plan to upgrade all the SDG based standard in every 5 years. So we are we have a time to do for the progress of Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan. So we have a time, need to time. Therefore we have a plan to report all the VNR in maybe the next 2 years. Next slide. Cooperate with some activities, mission projects with the UNSDG FIT. There are 6 missions. We are ongoing process, 5 missions and 6 missions ongoing process. Occurs in COVID-19 period. Data shortage for monitoring of SDGs occur. Then during the COVID-19 period, with the governments and public in operational level, technical level, networking level, communication level, in order to data for SDG monitoring, and then capacity development of CSO staff and other line ministry staff to be strengthened. Next slide. I would like to move to the way forwards. We need to provide open data SDG platform with the help of the UN and then to require the translation on the UN media data Excel templates, as well as the fee required by Women SDG. Then to prepare study GI repository and the data and media data available. If you want to have any questions or if you want to know details, please look for our website www.mss.gov.mm and www.csostat.gov.mm. Please send me an email through cso.gov.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. New Mong. It's very interesting to see how much work you have already done in this short period of time, aligning strategies, looking at which specific COVID indicators are relevant in the SDG context. So we're looking forward to seeing more of the results of your work, and please share with us. I think it's also interesting for the other countries to learn from your experience and your work in the process moving forward. Although I also know that many of the other countries are also moving in this direction and gaining experience in this area. Are there any immediate questions for Myanmar from the participants? Something that you would like to clarify very quickly?
Yes, I have it.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I would like to ask Dr. Nini why they choose to upgrade this indicator every 5 years. Why they didn't think about the annual, maybe some indicator they can be upgraded once per year.
So did you hear the question, Dr. New Mong?
Can you hear the questions clearly? Please, pardon,
The question was whether or why you chose to mainly assess the SDGs every 5 years and not annually. That's how I understood it.
Yes, we collaborated with the UNDP, and so we have the SDG based on both 196 indicators. Now only in so we need to do the upgrade for the SDG based both in every 5 years. Thank you.
So it's a more comprehensive assessment every 5 years, but you monitor along the way. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I hope that helped clarify also for you, Emmanuel Christian. Any other quick questions before we move?
Hello, may I ask?
Sabarash.
Okay, so my question is just what is the role of the NSO, the Statistics Office, in monitoring the SDG, and what is the role of the Planning Commission or Ministry of Finance?
So just to repeat the question, Dr. New Mong, what is the role of the NSO in this context? And what is the role of the ministries, for instance, the Prime Minister's Office or the Ministry of Finance?
We have this risk about of CCDHUS. This is Vice President is the Vice President is chairperson of this CCDHUS. Our Director General of the CSO is the Secretary. So CSO is the organization. And then we have to do for the sustainable additional indicator frameworks. We have contributed this with jointly with the UNDP also.
So you're taking a main role when it comes to the indicator compilation and data work in this process. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Was that helpful, Abhirash?
Just quick questions to Elena.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Davlatzoda.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just one clarification, one question. Elena, did you already collect this data for your presentation through international organization? But did you make any times to compare on the national level or with some authority in member countries like statistical offices or other sources? I think this is already estimation or some data which you are received from international organizations like UNDP, ILO, or World Bank. The impact of COVID-19 to this second question, I think we can receive all presentation in electronic version because we need also to discuss everything with our people in our office. Thank you.
Thank you. Elena, do you want to respond?
Yes.
Please go.
Thank you, Mr. Davlatzoda, for your question. And just to say that, of course, we will be sharing both the presentation and also a recording of this session will be available for those who are interested. With regard to your question, yes, this is international organization data. So this is a report that was compiled by 36 international organizations who are part of the Committee for the Coordination of Statistical Activities. So this is not national data, this is estimates and also data collected by these agencies that I was presenting. But the intention was to give us kind of a context or kind of get us started thinking in this direction. Of course, as countries are able to monitor more their situations, we will have more concrete data and more country-led data. But right now, these are the estimates that the organizations are coming out with as we all try to deal with the crisis. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Elena. And with that, I'd like to hand over the word to Richard Tonkin, who will present some of the more detailed work on Goal 1. Please go ahead, Richard.
Thank you, and hello everyone. So earlier, Heather gave an overview of the potential impacts of COVID-19 on the achievement of the SDGs. And now, as Rebecca's just said, I'm going to look a bit more in detail at one goal as an example, focusing on Goal 1, which, as you all know, is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. My presentation is focused on the global and regional level based on data from various international organisations, but hopefully it can offer you some ideas on how, in your national reporting, you can examine the impacts of COVID-19 in the context of the SDG framework, supporting line ministries in developing their plans and policies for the way ahead. So, key to the achievement of Goal 1 is the eradication of extreme poverty. And as you probably know, as this chart shows, the share of the world's population living in extreme poverty has been falling, declining from 15.7% in 2010 to 10% in 2015. However, the pace of global poverty reduction has been deaccelerating, with the latest nowcast estimates putting the global poverty rate in 2019 at 8.2%. So that slowing of progress means that even before COVID-19, baseline projections were suggesting that 6% of the global population would still be living in extreme poverty in 2030, meaning we'd miss the target of ending poverty. However, the economic impacts of the pandemic are likely to further limit progress. So based on current expectations regarding the spread of the pandemic and on the recovery of economic activity, the poverty rate is projected to be at 8.8% in 2020. This would mean the first rise in global poverty since 1998, bringing the rate back close to the 2017 level. Also means an estimated 71 million additional people will be living in extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19. Next slide. Thank you. So the places where the virus is taking its highest toll kind of on poverty depends primarily on two factors. First, the impact of the virus on economic activity, and second, on the number of people living close to the international poverty line. The World Bank in their latest projections expect that GDP will be hit hardest in advanced economies, with a fall of around 7% in 2020, whilst emerging markets and developing economies will contract by 2.5%. However, with more people living close to the international poverty line in the developing world, it's low and middle income countries that are expected to suffer the greatest consequences in terms of extreme poverty. So based on the $1.90 a day extreme poverty line, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are expected to see the largest rises in poverty, with an additional 32 and 26 million people respectively living below the poverty line as a result of the pandemic. You can see from the chart that at higher poverty lines, the regional distribution of the added poor changes a lot. Of the 176 million people expected to be pushed into poverty at the $3.20 poverty line, 2/3 are in South Asia. Of the 177 million expected to be pushed into poverty at $5.50, many of the newly poor will be living in East Asia and the Pacific. Next slide, please. If we turn to look at working poverty, again, we see that considerable progress has been made over the last decade, with the share of the world's workers living in extreme poverty falling by half over this time, from 14.3% in 2010 to 7.1% in 2019. However, again, we've seen the pace of progress slowing since 2013, meaning that reinvigorated efforts are already necessary to reach the 2030 target. And again, the impacts of COVID-19 are projected to push millions more workers into poverty. We know that as of April, the recommended or required workplace closures around the world affected 81% of employers and 66% of own account workers, severely limiting both jobs and income. And the pandemic also risks undoing some of the progress that has been made in gender equality. The gender gap in working poverty had almost been bridged over recent years, but the evidence is emerging that women are being disproportionately affected by the pandemic. We also know that inadequate earnings and poor job quality mean that younger workers are more exposed to poverty than adults, with the size of this gap unchanged over the last decade. These differences are only likely to get worse in the current crisis, which has already led to a sharp increase in unemployment and underemployment, a decline in labour income, and new job quality challenges. Next slide. So, moving to think about social protection, it's clear that strong social protection systems are essential for mitigating both the immediate impact and long-term economic consequences of the pandemic and preventing many more people from falling into poverty. Despite this, 55% of the world's population, about 4 billion people, did not have any form of social protection in 2016 when the most recent statistics are available. The crisis has had huge impacts on unemployment in many countries, but based on this latest data we have, only 22% of unemployed workers were covered by unemployment benefits. We also know that as of February this year, only 87 countries had unemployment protection programs that are anchored in national legislation. Well, just 34 of these schemes in these countries covered the self-employed. As you can see from this chart, the extent of unemployment benefit coverage varies substantially across regions. While half of unemployed people in Australia and New Zealand and 44% in Europe and North America receive unemployment payments, they're received by just 3% of the unemployed in Sub-Saharan Africa and 12% in Latin America and the Caribbean. Unfortunately, there's No figure for this indicator at the regional level for Central and Southern Asia due to the low population coverage of available data. So we move on to, thank you. So finally, I just wanted to highlight the indicators relating to another target under Goal 1, which is to build the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations, and reduce their exposure and vulnerability to climate-related extreme events and other economic, social, and environmental shocks and disasters. So COVID-19 is just one clear example of the type of biological hazard which, along with other types of hazards such as hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, wildfires, cause disasters and worsen poverty. Based under the latest reporting under the Sendai framework, we know that in 2018, 23,458 deaths and 2,164 persons missing were attributed to disasters, while direct economic losses of 23.6 billion were reported. But perhaps one of the most concerning aspects of this data is that it shows that the least developed countries were disproportionately affected by disasters. So those LDCs reporting disaster-related losses accounted for 14% of the total population of all the countries reporting losses, but it accounted for over 29% of the total reported deaths and missing persons attributed to disasters. And similarly, the economic impacts of disasters were also larger for LDCs relative to the size of their economies. Those LDCs reporting economic losses made up 2% of the total GDP of all the countries reporting such losses, but suffered 10% of the total direct economic losses. Thinking about the current situation, the importance of disaster risk strategies is perhaps clearer than ever. And one of the indicators under this goal relates to the number of countries that adopt and implement national disaster risk reduction strategies in line with the Sendai framework. Currently, 85 countries report having a national strategy, which is at least partly aligned to this framework. In the current crisis, there's also a particular challenge for the national organisations responsible for disaster risk management, who are having to adapt their preparations for extreme weather events and other hazards causing disasters to take account of COVID-19 and the steps necessary to reduce its impact to avoid one compounding the effects of the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for giving us more details on what we've seen on global level related to Goal 1. Could we have next slide, please? With this overall picture of the SDGs and how they've been impacted by the pandemic, we are moving on to a next but very related topic, and that is the high-level political forum in 2020. And at the high-level political forums, we usually take stock of how we are progressing on the SDGs with the voluntary national reviews of a selected number of countries. And this year, out of the 47 countries that will be presenting their VNRs, 8 of them are UNSD DFID project countries. The HLPF will be held online this year through various webinars, etc., from the 7th to the 16th of July. And the pre-agreed topic is accelerated action and transformative pathways, realizing the decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. There will, of course, be adjustments, and there will be more focus on the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the meetings that will be organized is a VNR lab that UN Statistics Division is organizing, called Evidence-Based VNRs in the Time of the COVID-19 Pandemic. It will take place on the 9th of July from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard. And it will be convened on WebEx. We will share registration with you later, and we will bring in some of you, and you will be contacted shortly, those of you who will be asking to contribute to this event. And with this, I also want to hand over the words to our colleague from Uganda, Mr. Moses Mr. Hoses Tegesa. He's a commissioner at the Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda. Please go ahead with your presentation, and we're looking forward to hearing about your experience in the 2020 Vienna preparation and how you have adjusted to also include COVID-19 response. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. This presentation is in 4 steps. The introduction, which will be brief, our process, online consultations, and the lessons we have learned. You realize that from the topic, the focus will be on the 3rd bit. The first 2 are just to set the context. Next. As part of the introduction, it's not written there, I wish to inform you that from Uganda, we are 2 participants. I'm with my colleague, Albert Jamudisha, who may have introduced himself earlier on, and head of the SDG Secretariat in Uganda. The one we are going to participate in July is our 2nd one, having been in one in 2016, the VNR. And this report, as had earlier been shown in the first slide, will also give us the progress made and will provide detailed progress of implementation, as well as the policy, institutional, and the programmatic enablers, together with the successes and challenges we have encountered on each of the SDGs. Next. In preparing our 2020 VNR report, we took note of the lessons we had learned in the 2016 report. The lessons are various, but a key one was the coordination framework, which we thought, once focused on, would pin all the other lessons we had learned and put them to better delivery of services for our citizens. And after the coordination, and as part of the broader framework of government, we have put in place a national SDG task force, which is headed by the Permanent Secretary, Office of the Prime Minister. We have formed a UN country team aside of the SDG task force, and we have put in place an advisory committee to oversee or to coordinate the writing of the VNR 2020. I'll just say one or two points about this advisory committee, and then I'll leave this page. This advisory committee was a realization that we need to strongly have the multi-sectoral, multi-agency, and multi-government. When I say multi, I mean the local government at their various levels and the national government. This advisory committee was appointed at one of our national task force meetings, and it was headed by no other than our technical advisor for the SDG Secretariat, Dr. Albert Jamudisha. But its main purpose was to ensure that no one is left behind in the spirit of the SDGs. And you will see the different players, everything from government, civil society, private sector, and the UN family. Next. Statistics is something we thought we should say something about, though our colleagues have mentioned much about statistics. But what I can say is that we followed the fundamental principles of official statistics as stipulated by the UN. And importantly, we're proud to note that we had 45 SDG indicators that we thought we could measure or could report on adequately following the global metadata requirements just the last 3 months. But as per today, when we go for the VNR 20 reporting, we have 92 with additional 47 indicators having come on board. And I want to thank the UN family for this great support, the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, a key partner, the SDG Secretariat, and many more across government who have made us to reach this far. So this 2020 VNR report, we are going to report an additional 47 indicators than we had previously, just in the last 3 months. And as you may have noted in our 2016 first VNR, we are much less than this. And we think that moving forward, we shall continue with the support of the UN agencies and with other partners to improve our reporting capacity and our data collection capacity across government. Next. Our VNR process has been participatory. I will not go so much beyond these pictures, but the picture on the right gives one of the members of parliament in Uganda from Eastern Uganda, standing there in our traditional dress called gomesi. And important about that photo is that Uganda is moving towards localizing the SDGs, bringing them to local government level. And we were happy to participate in one of the acclaimed mechanisms of doing this. And that is in a district called Ngora in Western Uganda, in Eastern Uganda, where we are trying to see whether the voluntary reporting, now it will call it voluntary local reporting, VLR, a phrase that we are proud of because it will go down to our 135 local governments at district level and cascade much lower to local governments. And starting with Ngora gave us pride, as you read from our detailed report. There are many statements made by the local leadership and the technical leadership at district local level who acclaimed and who ascertained the fact that the SDGs are enshrined in our planning frameworks, which cascade down to the development planning at district level. So the picture on the left highlights the fact that we are now getting into emphasis of the local government or localization LDGs down to the lowest level of government. On the right is a picture of our permanent secretaries in Uganda. Permanent secretaries are the overall technical heads in various ministries, and they lead the sectors across which the government planning frameworks are hinged. In Uganda, we have got 18 sector working groups, and below that are institutions with related mandates or institutions that seek to deliver common outcomes. And these ladies and gentlemen you see on the picture on the right head those different sector working groups that seek to ensure that right from the lower levels and right from across government, all institutions that seek to achieve common outcomes come together to avoid duplication and to avoid wastage and to avoid repetition, and therefore we save our resources and also bring uniformity, inclusivity, and participation across government. And in these sectors, we also have civil society, we also have UN partners, we have donor development partners, and we have religious leaders, civil society, civic community-based organizations, and many more facets of society. So it's a government plus a society approach. And through these, ladies and gentlemen, we get the technical overall representation and guidance. Next. Our consultative processes, as I told you earlier, we have the advisory committee that is headed by Dr. Albert Byamugisha. You can see him there, facing with the back facing me, and that is in one of the many advisory committees. And these advisory committees meetings transcended the whole of government to bring everybody on board. And on the right is civil society. These pictures are just evidences of our process and its participatory nature. Next. COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll notice that this is actually the core of our presentation. When the pandemic started, we had been in high gear. Many consultations had been programmed, many meetings had been programmed, and other engagements that were relating to delivering a very consultative and participatory VNR report. And when the VNR pandemic came in, we did not stop. Importantly, I wish to inform this meeting that we used online engagements, and the major ones were three, which I will concentrate on. We had the e-platform, the U platform, and we have the Zoom-enabled technology. The e-platform, as you will note from this presentation, captured voices of the public, and it established a popularized and consultative and inclusive platform using social media, using TV, radio, and many others. That graph in front of me gives the many participants. You will see that on this particular one, we have got participants from Uganda, Kenya, and many other countries. Of course, most were from Uganda, over 600, but we had many other participants who had their views on this platform and brought their input. The questions that were asked on this platform had different dimensions and parameters, ranging from familiarity with the SDGs, the interest areas, the areas where we needed improvement, where we had performed best, and the ideas of what people thought about leaving no one behind, about the roles of the local governments, about the innovations, and even about the lessons that people thought, or different participants thought, that we had learned. In addition to the e-platform, we had what we called the UNICEF U Reporter. And this one attracted more than 23,000 young people who shared their views and aspects that they thought mattered in the VNR. Among these were youth from local governments, youth from the city, and of course, across all our consultations, we noted that most of our viewers were from the city, and we attributed some of this to the access to internet and computers and technology, and something we have learned this process, upping our capacities in technology, and moving forward, we shall ensure that our capacities in accessing internet and in e-usage are improved to ensure that in the next reporting or in the next engagements, we shall have as many as possible coming on through the e-arrangement. Next. These are just some of the voices and some of the messages from the citizens. Members on the platform can read those, but they all attest to their thoughts of what they thought or what they felt about the SDGs and what they felt about our progress. You will notice that of the consulted people, we had 55.6 were male and 44.5 female, and civil society 27.8%, and government and local government together made something like 27 point something %, and the other citizens all fall in these broad categories. Talk of government, talk of private sector, talk of development partners, and civil society. Next. The EU reporting, 3 out of every 5 Ugandan young people had never heard of SDGs. 7 out of 10 youth reported to have experienced at least one range of climate-related effects. These are just the major bits were pulled out, but there are many. But importantly, you notice that of the responses we had, most were from male and few were from females. And that is something we shall interrogate further and even report on, we have reported on in our detailed report. Next. Key lessons. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed fundamental sustainable development weaknesses across the world, and Uganda has not been an exception. And one notable one, which I have mentioned to you, is the use of e-technology. Unfortunately, the crisis hit at a time when the SDGs were gaining traction, as the presentation of Uganda's Voluntary National Review will demonstrate. And by this, I mean the detailed report. But as a country, we have tried to leverage on technology modalities to fast track our preparation process for the VNR. And this brings me to the third engagement. I talked about the EU reporting by UNICEF, and the e-platform. And the third one majorly has been the Zoom-enabled technology. This was courtesy to the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, under the UN, who were able to support government with various licenses, and this enabled continuity of the government structures. And as I had earlier mentioned, the government structures are structured in such a way that there's political and there's technical. At a political level, we have the big national task force on COVID, chaired by the Right Honorable Prime Minister. And even in the VNR processes, as we continued, this task force has engaged in creating policy and putting measures of adherence in place. It was also able to support the process in that the milestones like reporting and getting approvals and ownership by the various levels of the coordination framework would still be reached using the Zoom-enabled approach. At technical level, the different sectors of government, all the sectors of government still meet 3 times a week, and their engagement and their deliberations have also enabled the VNR processes continue. And it is needless to say that even all other processes of inquiry, consultation, and even informing different levels for ownership have continued using this Zoom-enabled technology.
Thank you.
Next. Thank you for listening to me. Leave no one behind. Citizen dialogues. Tonde Kamavega is also something in Uganda, in our national language, which we have launched, and simply means leave no one behind. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And yeah, I like your infographic here. It's nice. And it's been very useful to hear your perspective and how you kind of worked in the current quite difficult circumstances, how you quickly found different solutions. So we're all looking forward to seeing your VNR and to hearing you present it at the high-level political forum. With it being online this year, it gives a lot more of us opportunity to listen to all the VNRs, and that's something I would encourage all of you who are participating in this webinar and your colleagues to actually listen in to some of these presentations by your partner countries. I now want to hand the word back to Elena again, who will lead the discussion on the work that we have been presenting so far. In addition to what she will be presenting, please also ask questions in the chat or directly. We're happy to try and respond together with Uganda and Myanmar colleagues.
Thank you, Viveka. And thank you to our presenters today. I think we heard 2 very good examples of a very good work being done under the circumstances that are quite challenging. And we heard some interesting responses, interesting kind of ways that we've been able to adjust. From Myanmar, we heard that surveys of COVID-19 impacts on household welfare and farm activities are going to be conducted, high-frequency monitoring surveys in collaboration with the UN country team, and they're setting up a high-frequency COVID-19 dashboard. And we also heard from Uganda about the work that they've been doing in preparing for their second VNR, which is also a good example of building on previous successes of the first VNR that they presented, and in adding another set, or doubling actually their set of indicators for the second VNR, and also under the circumstances adapting to the COVID-19 reality and how to conduct consultations and leveraging technologies in this new sort of pandemic environment that we're in. As well as, so what I thought very interesting, localizing SDG monitoring and having voluntary local reviews, which I think is a concept that other countries should take on board. I think it's a very good one. So I'd like to hear from other participants as well. Maybe you have questions or reactions to what you've heard today from our country presenters or from one of us. There's a few questions that you see on the screen, which are meant to stimulate you to think what you would like to share. So it would be great to hear about how SDG monitoring has been impacted in your country, if you've had to make adjustments, what kind of adjustments they have been, what has your experience been? And of course, we'd like to bring this all back to how can we best support you? How can we continue to provide you with technical assistance, with tools that you might need? How can we make the appropriate connections with different partners, different countries working on similar issues so that you can be supported in your work? So if anybody would like to jump in with any questions or comments.
So maybe while you're still thinking a little bit about questions, we had a question in the chat from Mustafa from the Palestine Bureau of Statistics, who had asked us about the last interagency and expert group meeting. So maybe as some of you have seen in the chat, Heather has been responding to that. You can find the link in the chat window to a recording on this. So it will give you a chance to get a better understanding of presentations from countries, the work program for 2020, have a look at agency and stakeholder presentations, etc.
We have a request from Mozambique. They wanted to ask a question, maybe? I think they'll be speaking Portuguese, and then I can try to translate.
Muito obrigada, Helena. Agradecemos a participação. Imensas desculpas pela nossa entrada tardia, mas conseguimos acompanhar as últimas apresentações, as quais não se difere o processo daquilo que é a situação atual também em Moçambique. O Covid veio impactar, sim, no processo da elaboração dos VNRs, porque limitou-nos um pouco o programa abrangente que tínhamos de monitoria e de consultas e envolvimento ao nível local. Tivemos uma primeira fase de consultas para a elaboração do documento, conseguimos ir até o nível dos distritos, mas já para levarmos o documento à validação, ficamos um pouco limitados de ir até os distritos por causa do Covid, mas usamos os meios alternativos, que foi usar o e-mail. Então, usamos mais o e-mail para partilha de documentos e receber os comentários para a finalização do relatório. Estamos agora no processo da finalização, onde estamos a harmonizar a informação, estatística, e estamos preparados para submeter os documentos na data prevista, que é já depois de amanhã. Então, o Covid, além do impacto econômico que tem ao nível do país, para a implementação dos SDGs também, está a limitar o âmbito da abrangência no processo da implementação, isto porque a priorização dos recursos agora para o combate ao Covid, também há limitação em termos de movimentação, a limitação para o processo da localização dos próprios SDGs também, mas mesmo com estes constrangimentos todos, acreditamos que vamos continuar a trabalhar para assegurar a implementação do nosso plano.
Obrigada. Eu vou tentar traduzir para não esquecer nada, tá bom? I'm just going to translate the intervention by Mozambique. So they were giving us an update on their VNR process. They will be presenting their VNR this year. And of course, work has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. They had been planning a number of different consultations, and they were able to do those consultations at the district level for the most part, but they were hoping to go further to localize the SDGs and to have consultations more locally, but that was affected by the pandemic. But they've adjusted. They've been conducting consultations by email in some places. So work is still moving along, and they are hoping to submit all of the documents shortly, I think in the next couple of days by the due date for the VNR. And of course, also they are pointing out challenges with funding, because a lot of funding has been redirected to COVID-19 response. So that's been a challenge, but work has been progressing, and they're happy to report that they will be presenting this year. Okay, thank you very much, Mozambique. It looks like the end of the intervention. Does anyone else have questions or comments? How has your experience been in your country? Or maybe even more importantly for us, how can UNSD best support going forward?
Uma questão para a Uganda. Eles disseram que usaram o e-platform para as consultas. Gostaria de entender um pouco mais como é que funcionou ou como é que está a funcionar esta plataforma eletrônica.
Okay, so this question is for Uganda from Mozambique. They were interested in the e-platform for consultations that you were mentioning, and they would like to know how that works exactly to do the consultations electronically. And Mr. Joseph Tegeza, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that.
Hello, thank you. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. The question is about the e-platform.
Yes, for consultations.
Yes, this e-platform, it was established and it captures the voices from various different medias, and it's popularized. There's an SDG secretariat that government established that supports and does the day-to-day running, whereby it ensures that the different ideas that are given on the e-platform, all that are viewed. For example, we had 850 views from over 400 visitors. And like I had said earlier, 600 were from Uganda. You saw that graph. And it really had 3 pages majorly. There was a page that was providing informative details about the VNR, the whole process, the international process, and the high-level political forum, what it's all about. Then there was a page that was outlining the progress that has been made so far by the country. And then another page was giving details on how individuals could contribute their voices to the VNR report and process through surveys, comments, and then discussion, and then Zoom chats. And when this happened, like I said earlier, there were also questions that people were looking at to inform their thinking. The survey, the familiarity with SDGs, the interest areas, the improvement areas, and then the areas where we had performed well. And when people would get access to the Zoom chats or this platform, then the analysis was done by the SDG secretariat. And like I mentioned earlier, on this very meeting, with the SDG technical advisor, who was actually at the forefront of this, who supports government on this. And then I know we don't have much time, but if Albert could just say one sentence about how this process helped us, can say something in addition to what I have said to bring it more into context. Is that fine, Elena?
Thank you very much, Joseph. Exactly as you have said, the e-platform is a partial website which we developed here with a variety of questions that we sent to different categories, different interest groups in the country, ranging from the youth, the women, the academicians, the politicians, private sector, etc. So because of the COVID-19, and we have lockdown in Uganda, most people are at home. And all the time they are searching on their phones, on their laptops, etc. So they got the questions, they answered, and we analyzed these questions that were put it and came up with voices from different categories and put them together and actually informed the voluntary national report. And as a requirement, of course, one of the guidelines says that in preparing the VNR, we should be open, inclusive, participatory, highly consultative, and transparent for all people, and get information from them. So exactly that's what we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Albert and Mr. Tegeta, very much.
Elena, something about Elena.
Yes.
Yeah, just something about the discussion in number 7.
Yes.
Apart from that, thanks Albert for having underscored that. I just wanted to say something about the impact on our monitoring processes and the adjustments, and probably members could also advise on how we can be helped. Just like probably others have experienced it, but in Uganda, like I mentioned earlier, our planning frameworks have got SDGs embedded into them. Actually, this coming NDP 3.0 National Development Plan, we are going to be 100% aligned with SDGs. And this means that the M&E frameworks also follow the government processes. And in the government, we have got a department, a directorate fully in charge of monitoring, and it spreads its wings across government. But what we have now faced as an impact is that we are now doing what I can call verbal monitoring. One, we only talk via Zoom-enabled technologies and say where we think we have got and get reports, as opposed to the previous arrangement where we could physically see where we are. And one adjustment that we are thinking of is how we can empower the local governments or the lower levels, or empower our systems to ensure that we even get the physical, probably by getting photos at a lower level taken, or like I said earlier, spreading our technologies. And therefore the support that we need greatly in terms of the COVID atmosphere or the new normal we are at is support whereby we can share experiences or learn from others how they have managed to get the physical into the monitoring aspect, so that what we see on paper and what we talk verbally is also evidenced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tegeta. I think we have also a question from you to Uganda in the chat from Tanzania, from Saroni Jupai, who's asking what are the challenges of changing the modalities of the VNR consultation, and did you get the expected outputs from this ENU platform?
Yeah, thank you very much. The challenges, like we mentioned, there were some challenges, but one of the major challenges is that much as we try to consult as widely as possible, the audiences we could get to are the audiences that are near computers and the audiences that are near the internet access. And therefore, this meant that the principle of leaving no one behind, much as we struggled to do that, probably was not reached the way we would have wanted. But what we have done is what is possible within our means, in that all representations of the groups have been included. People with disabilities, people in local governments, civil society, parliament, all the key stakeholders. We have approached them, but where we feel that we probably have done better if there was no COVID would have been our approach of physically moving down to the people whom we know can't access laptops, can't access technology, and hear from them. So the hearing was by proxy from their representations. And we take that to be the best we could get in the approximations, but probably I can take that to have been our challenge. That was the setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tegesa. Thank you. That's definitely a challenge that is, I think, cuts across all of our countries, how to reach those that don't have the internet capacity. As we mentioned in our earlier in the presentations, this is definitely something that's creating further inequalities between countries and within countries as well. So if you're at least addressing it by proxy, I think that's already looking in the right direction. I think we might need to end at this point our discussion just because of time constraints. But of course, you can always send us questions by email, and if it's a question to one of the other participants, we can also direct those. I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you everyone so much for joining. I hope you found this webinar also useful, and I hope that it has given you some more input on how you can look at and work on the effects the pandemic has had on the SDGs, and how you can continue your work in this regard. I also wanted to mention and remind us all that we could use the SDG platforms and also potentially the COVID-19 hubs to visualize some of the work that is being done and visualize how the pandemic is affecting the SDGs and other aspects of the society. We have earlier informed you that we will be running a webinar also going more into these COVID-19 hubs, maybe sharing some of the work that some of some of you actually have been doing in this, and this will be shared with you shortly. I also want to remind those of you who are using OpenSDG that we will have an OpenSDG webinar Wednesday next week. Those of you who are using it or are planning to use it have already received invitations, but if there are others that are interested, of course, please let us know. From this webinar, as has been said, we will share the recording and we will share also the presentations with you. And as you might have seen already, we are also making these recordings and the presentations available at the UNSD DFID project webpage. You will find them under meetings. From our side, we found it quite useful to have these webinars, so we will continue, but we would also be happy to hear from you if there are specific topics you think we could discuss as part of these webinars. So please let us know bilaterally if you have any topics that you think could be useful for the webinar series that we are running as part of the UNSD DFID project. Or also if there are specific things that you would like to present that you think could be interesting to the other countries. With that, I want to thank you all again for joining and for actively participating. Thank you so much for thank you so much to those of you who presented, especially thanks to our presenters from Myanmar and Uganda for sharing your experiences. I think that is a very useful support to all of us to know what is going on in the different countries and to learn from each other. Looking forward to seeing you again all soon, and stay healthy and safe in the meantime. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.